Greetings, my name is Jaymie Heilman and I teach Latin American and Caribbean history at the University of Alberta. La Universidad de Alberta respetuosamente reconoce que estamos ubicados sobre el territorio del Tratado 6, territorios tradicionales de las primeras naciones y el pueblo métis. The University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are situated on Treaty 6 territories, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. So the very first time I heard Edmonton's Treaty 6 territorial acknowledgement spoken in Spanish was at a 2019 event that was held to express solidarity with the thousands of Central American asylum seekers who are being held in just horrifying conditions in detention camps on the US-Mexico border. At that event, a U of A student who himself had been born in Colombia, he spoke that acknowledgement in Spanish, recognizing the long indigenous history of the city we now call Edmonton, as well as the fact that Edmonton has the second largest indigenous population of any city in Canada. And the student's Spanish words were a really powerful reminder to all of those present that we're all part of the Americas, that todos somos americanos. And those connections between Canada and Central America are ones that help explain both some of the really deep concern that I hold about the ongoing humanitarian crisis in the northernmost Central American countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, as well as the profound respect that I have for the work of Sombrilla, and most crucially, for the very particular way that Sombrilla does its work. So in July of 2020, just a few months ago, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees reported that there were 470,000 refugees and asylum seekers from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And on top of those 470,000 refugees and asylum seekers, there were an additional 318,000 internally displaced people, so people who had been pushed from their homes and were living in other parts of their home countries, just in El Salvador and Honduras alone. If we added in Guatemala, the numbers would certainly be significantly higher. There were and remain many different reasons why Central Americans have been forced to flee from their home communities and in many cases from their home countries. Climate change is rapidly drying up the agricultural lands that many depend upon for their own subsistence, just as the brutal winds and rains wrought by this climate emergency and hurricanes are flooding many more pieces of land and destroying many, many homes. The devastation brought by November's Hurricane Eta which has left hundreds of Central Americans dead and destroyed countless homes. That's just the most recent example of a devastating climate crisis storm, and it's really just no doubt one of many more very extreme storms to come. Poverty throughout northern Central America is extreme, and the COVID-19 pandemic has made that poverty worse. In part, the problem is that remunerations, that the money sent by documented and undocumented migrants to family members, neighbors, former neighbors, relatives still living inside El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, those remunerations have really dried up as the global economy has collapsed. In addition, the very strict quarantines imposed by governments in northern Central American countries have made it very, very difficult for workers in the informal sector, as well as day laborers, just to earn enough money to survive. The rates of hunger actually got so high in the early months of the pandemic that many across Central America and even sort of across Latin America more broadly started hanging trapos, little flags. In Central America, they tended to be white flags, hanging little white flags outside their doorways to signal that they were hungry and that they needed support and help. One Salvadoran journalist noted just how quickly and remarkably Salvadorans responded, providing as much support as they possibly could to relatives, friends, neighbors, and even strangers. But those local expressions of care, while they're incredible, they're not enough to meet the extreme needs of our really terrible global moment and the hunger that is ensuing. There's another important reason why so many Central Americans are fleeing from their home countries, and that's something that has not abated with the pandemic, and that is gang violence. In 2014, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees interviewed 404 children who had just crossed the Mexico border into the United States. And in those interviews, nearly 60% of the kids signaled, and these were kids from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, as well as Mexico, nearly 60% of them signaled that their number one reason for fleeing was violence. In addition, in more recent years, we've seen a dramatic uptick in the number of women and girls fleeing. Those women and girls, not only are they reporting situations of generalized violence, but they're also speaking about really extreme conditions of gender-based violence, both being targeted for sexual relationships by gang members, but also the really sort of terrifying rates of femicide, women killed precisely because they are women. The COVID-19 pandemic has really brought no relief to this violence. The UNHCR reports that in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, displaced peoples and community leaders alike are reporting that criminal groups have been using the situations of quarantine and confinement to actually strengthen their control over neighborhoods, intensifying extortion, intensifying gender-based violence. And in those same countries, the extreme and often really arbitrary counter-violence of state forces like the police and the military, as well as private security forces that in many ways are more like paramilitary organizations, those are only compounding the violence and the insecurity that is really fueling this exodus from northern Central America. So the news from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras is difficult, and I think that we need to recognize just how extreme the situation there is. But I also really want to stress and have us remember that there are meaningful and important expressions of solidarity and care, even right here in Edmonton, for those in crisis in Central America. But that solidarity and care is not at all about white saviorism or arrogant presumptions that advanced Canadians can and should somehow swoop in and heroically rescue helpless people suffering in the South. Not at all. And in fact, that very model of supposedly heroic white saviorism has landed prominent charities in some very serious trouble over the past few months. As I'm sure you know, the Canadian We charity became the subject of a major controversy because of its role in administering a very large federal grant for a federal summer student grant program. But what you might not know is that there's a much longer and deeper scandal linked to the We charity. And here I'm going to quote an academic organization. This is the Canadian Association for the Study of International Development. So this organization says the following. They issued a statement about We. They said, and I quote, "We trips are predicated on a model of voluntourism, where the actual beneficiaries are the youth, mostly Canadian students, who travel to poorer countries on feel-good trips to boost their self-esteem and often their resumes, but have fewer or no benefits for the communities themselves. We events, including We Day most notably, are filled with white saviorism imagery and messaging that casts individuals and communities in the global south as helpless victims of local poverty, inequality, and corruption. This is a dangerous and damaging narrative that strips individuals of their agency and humanity while also ignoring the harmful effects of global capitalism, racism, and the legacy of colonialism in many countries in the global south. Close quote. And even the Nobel Prize winning Doctors Without Borders, an organization that I myself supported for many, many years, even Doctors Without Borders has found itself embroiled in a very similar scandal. Just earlier this year, 1,000 current and former staff members of Doctors Without Borders signed a statement asserting that the organization is institutionally racist and reinforces colonialism and white supremacy in its humanitarian work. And I bring up these two scandals in part because they help us understand and see just how different Sombrilla is. Because Sombrilla works in a very, very different way. A model that very much rejects this sort of notion of white saviorism and advanced Canadians swooping in and doing the work of rescuing helpless Central Americans. Not at all. A very, very common motto or refrain in Latin American activist circles is "Solo el pueblo salva al pueblo." So only the people will save the people. And that's really the kind of spirit that I see defining much of the work that Sombrilla does. A number of Sombrilla board members over the years have themselves been Latin American, and numerous other board members are themselves immigrants or children of immigrants from countries across the global south. And it's not just who Sombrilla is, but the kind of work that Sombrilla does. Sombrilla very much operates through close connections with local partners. In the example of El Salvador, working really hand in hand with SEBES to sort of shape priorities and shape work together, working off of relationships of mutual respect and setting priorities through dialogue and exchange. And Sombrilla reminds us that the connections between Canada and Central America are not about us and them, but rather fundamentally about us and us. So I know many of us have been holding our breath over the last few weeks and months, waiting, over the last 4 years, waiting to see if the November 3rd presidential election would bring change to the United States. Now that the results are in and we know that change is going to come, hopefully, it's incumbent on Canadians as we sort of exhale that we not look away from what's going on in Central America and northward, and that we also take a really hard look at the policies and practices of our government, our corporations, our social justice organizations, and ourselves to really make sure that our words and actions are fundamentally about solidarity, not about complicity. Remembering first and foremost that solo el pueblo salva al pueblo, and that we are part of the pueblo, that todos somos americanos, that we're all citizens of the Americas. So thank you to Sombrilla for this invitation to speak briefly about the very important work you do. But far beyond that, thank you to Sombrilla and your amazing local partners for modeling for us the kind of path that social justice organizations really can and should take. Thank you. Gracias.